Hello and welcome back to At World's Edge, the Fantasy Lore podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Cataclysm, which was the birth of chaos into the Warhammer fantasy world. Ultimately, this single event is what created the world that we know of, and we play in Warhammer, and then even into the Age of Sigmar, because without this event, the entities known as the Gods of Chaos would never have been able to identify the humans, dwarves, and elves that they once destroyed on the world that was, and then of course followed into the Age of Myth and then the Age of Sigmar. So without further ado, let's talk about the birth of chaos into the Warhammer world. This should be a multi-part series where we're going to start with the Great Cataclysm and go into the war that followed and then the results. But all of it began with the coming of the Old Ones. The Old Ones are the gods of the Warhammer world, with a capital G, essentially, described as coming to the world on silvery ships. They then reforged what we know as the Warhammer world into a planet, which we then know as the Warhammer world. But beforehand, it would have been unrecognizable. It was a frozen wasteland, not populated by any of the races that we're familiar with. Though with the exception of dragons and Fimir, both of whom were present on the Warhammer world. But at the beginning, before the coming of the Old Ones, it was just a frozen rock. There were no humans or elves or dwarves, no giants, no greenskins, and certainly no chaos. In order to facilitate their terraforming that they were doing, they brought with them the lizardmen, the Slann, and who then created the skinks and Kroxigors and Saurus that served them. And they also brought with them massive architectural and technological achievements. The greatest of these were the Polar Gates. Now, before the Old Ones came, magic did not exist in the Warhammer world. By either accident or design, the veil between the Empyrean or Ether or Realm of Chaos as it's known was fully functional at that time, and there were no cracks in it, at least on this world. But in order to build the world, the Old Ones had to use magic. This was one of their essential resources. So they built the Polar Gates, which were a direct line into the warp, as Warhammer 40k fans would know it, or into the Realm of Chaos as fantasy players and Age of Sigmar players know it. And from this, they were able to draw magic. It came out of the poles in the same way that wind goes across the world, but instead of flooding the world as it is, in a torrent of magic, it's a controlled resource like a dam or a spick. So the Old Ones created the Polar Gates, and they had magic coming out, and they were using it, and that went on for about 10,000 years. There was plenty of order as far as the creation was going. They using the Slann and the Saurus, they moved the continents into the position they were in. They created the races that we know today, some of which there is evidence that they created other races that simply didn't make the cut. But they also were only half done with some of them. There's evidence that the giants, ogres, and halflings, for example, were not fully formed. The Old Ones simply hadn't gotten time to finish their work before the Great Cataclysm. So what was the Great Cataclysm? Remember we talked about the Polar Gates being like a controlled magical release. Well, for whatever reason, probably through the machinations of chaos, the Polar Gates collapsed. This is a literal event where the gigantic mountain-sized edifice that was the Polar Gate at the north and south poles of the world collapsed in on themselves. The northern one, we know, for example, threw up so much warpstone dust that it actually became Morrslieb, the second moon of the world. And immediately the world changed. The Polar Gates being gone caused the magic to just run rampant and flood the world in a way that has not happened since, and didn't happen before that, and wouldn't happen again until the end times. And we're not going to talk about how those actions proceeded, but we will tell you that among the results immediately of the Polar Gates collapsing, the Old Ones disappeared. We don't know if they pieced out because their plan wasn't working and they didn't care anymore. We don't know if they were killed or if they were by chaos or if they were simply unable to exist in the world with that much magic. That we do not know. There's no evidence or canonical reference to exactly what happened to the Old Ones. And unlike in, say, 40k's Necrons, there isn't an enemy that really is fighting against the Old Ones. Chaos exists because chaos exists, and they're just happy they were able to come into the world. They weren't really hunting down the Old Ones, at least not that anything says. But as soon as the Polar Gates collapsed, the Old Ones disappeared, and the world immediately flooded with chaos. But when there's enough magic, as any demon player from the tabletop will know, demons can appear more easily. And appear they did, flooding across the world. The lizard men fought them in Lustria and the Southlands. The High Elves would fight them in Ulthuan, and even the dwarf ancestor gods would make their stand in the World's Edge Mountains, leading their people deeper into the mountains to form their holds, which would later form the basis of the Karazhan-Kor, or the Society of the Dwarves. There are other stories as well of the Tomb King's gods being creatures that fought against chaos, but these are not mentioned enough to talk too highly about them at this point, so we'll leave that to the next video that talks about the war itself. But it's suffice to say that with the collapse of the Polar Gates, chaos was, as we know it, born into the world. Beastmen were created, demons could arise, so mutation was created, demons could materialize on the mortal plane with impunity, and humans, which were the most changeable, started to collect in the north of the world. They couldn't reach the south because maybe there's too many beastmen, or because of the oceans in the way. And humans just weren't that evolved yet technologically, but they did collect in the north and became the earliest disciples of what we would know as the Warriors of Chaos. Immediately the Cataclysm shattered some of the races who had been existing in the world and who had been evolving, leading to the Ogres forced to move across the world because of the Great Maw's formation. It led to the alliance between the dragons and high elves because both races realized they needed each other. Athel Loren, which had originally covered all of the old world and much of it beyond, was immediately decimated, being shrunk to nearly nothing. And as far as the world itself, it stood on the brink of annihilation. The Slann were unable to contain the energies, and that led to what we're going to call the first incursion of chaos. And that will be the subject of our next video on this matter. What's important to know is that the birth of chaos into the Warhammer world was a direct result of the Old Ones' arrival and then use of magic, a resource they just didn't fully understand and couldn't control. And those actions had far-reaching implications, reaching all the way, as we said, into the Age of Sigmar, where chaos runs rampant across all of the 9 realms that were born out of the world that was, which was destroyed, which of course was this world we're looking at in the events of Warhammer the End Times. So please stay tuned. I hope to have the next update to this later this week, since I'll be gone in the weekend, and we will pick up our story there. Thank you for anyone who took the time to listen today, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more frequency or cadence of these updates going forward. You all have a great day, and thank you for tuning in.